You have probably heard the number. 500 million pounds of pure copper vanish from the shores of Lake Superior. You have probably heard the claim. Ancient miners dug 10,000 pits, worked them for thousands of years, left almost nothing behind. You have probably heard the theory that the copper crossed the Atlantic, that it armed the bronze swords of Mycenaean Greece. None of it is quite true. The number is wrong. The theory is fringe. The pits were not all mines, but strip away the myth, and what remains is stranger. A real culture, a real industry, a real disappearance, and it raises a question almost no one asks. Why did they stop? To understand what actually happened, we have to go back to the source, to one specific island in one specific lake. Isle Royale, Aiul Royul, sits in the cold northwestern waters of Lake Superior. 45 miles long, mostly bare rock, and along its spine runs something the geologists call a copper-bearing trap rock formation. Pure native copper, embedded in stone. Not copper ore, not a sulfide mineral that has to be smelted at 1400 degrees. Pure metal, already metal. You can pry it from the rock with a stone hammer and bend it cold into a knife. Almost no other place on Earth offers this. Around 7,000 years ago, the first miners arrived. They came in birch bark canoes across 40 miles of dangerous open water. They stayed for the summer. They left when ice closed the lake, and they came back year after year for 4,000 years. We call them the Old Copper Complex, a loose tradition of hunter-gatherer peoples spread across the western Great Lakes. No farms, no cities, no writing, and yet the oldest known metalworking tradition in the Americas and one of the oldest on Earth. So where does the myth of 500 million pounds come from? It comes from a survey done over 100 years ago. In the late 1800s, mining engineers tried to estimate how much copper the ancient miners had removed. They counted pits. They measured depressions in the rock. They multiplied. They got numbers in the hundreds of millions of pounds. By the 1920s, those numbers had hardened into folklore. Popular books repeated them. Newspapers repeated them. But the engineers were not archaeologists. They had no way to date the pits, no way to tell a mine from a natural hollow. Modern archaeology has gone back and looked, and the picture has shifted dramatically. The pit counts were inflated. Many of the so-called mine pits turned out to be natural depressions. Glacial, geological, never touched by a human hand. Of the genuine workings, most were small, a few feet deep, worked for a season, abandoned. The real volume of copper removed is hard to pin down, but the best modern estimates fall in the tens of thousands of pounds. Not 500 million, not even 5 million. The whole inflated arithmetic of a lost industrial empire, gone. And here is where most retellings stop. Myth busted. Move on. But that is the lazy ending, because the real story is just starting. Because even at the corrected volume, tens of thousands of pounds over thousands of years, what these people did was extraordinary. To understand why, you have to understand what they were actually doing, and how, in physical terms, they did it. Picture a flat slab of bare rock on a windswept island. Below the surface, embedded in the stone, a vein of green-stained copper. The miner does not have iron tools, no steel chisels, no gunpowder. He has a fist-sized stone hammer and a fire. He builds a fire on top of the rock. He lets it burn for hours. The stone heats unevenly. It begins to crack. Then he douses it with cold water from the lake. The thermal shock fractures the rock. Pieces flake off. He hammers at the cracks, hour after hour, day after day. The pit grows by inches. Eventually, copper, a nugget the size of a fist, sometimes the size of a head. Once in a century, the size of a man. The largest known mass of native copper ever found weighed over 5,000 pounds. The ancient miners worked around it. They could not move it. The smaller pieces they pried out cold. They hammered them. They annealed them, heating and quenching to soften the metal. And this is the part to remember. Hold on to it, because we will come back to it. They never melted the copper. In the entire 4,000-year span of the old copper complex, there is no clear evidence of true smelting. Not one furnace. They had the metal, they had the fire, they had the knowledge to anneal. But they did not take the next step. Why not? We will come back to that. First, what they made with what they had. The old copper complex produced one of the most varied metal toolkits of any pre-industrial society on the planet. Spear points, knives, awls, fishhooks, harpoon barbs, crescent-shaped blades, tanged daggers, adzes. More than 30 distinct tool types have been cataloged from sites across Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Ontario. And the work is fine, symmetrical, carefully ground. The makers understood the metal, its grain, its limits, when it would crack. Some of these tools predate the bronze swords of the Aegean. Some predate the copper tools of dynastic Egypt. In the strict chronological sense, the people of Lake Superior were among the first metal workers anywhere, 5000 BCE, maybe earlier. And if you came for forgotten chapters of the American past, stay with us. There is more, and the strangest part is still ahead, because there is a turn in this story, and it happens around the year 1500 BCE. For 3,000 years, the people of the Western Great Lakes had been making copper for use. Tools, weapons, working metal. Around 1500 BCE, that changes. Slowly at first, then completely. The utilitarian tools begin to disappear from the archaeological record. The mines slow down, the workshops shrink, and in their place, something else appears. Copper ornaments, beads, pendants, plates, ceremonial objects buried with the dead. The copper is still here, the skill is still here, but the purpose has shifted entirely, from use to meaning. By around 1000 BCE, the heavy mining is essentially over. The great working pits on Isle Royale go quiet. What replaces it is a network of ritual exchange. Copper as wealth, copper as prestige, copper as something you give back to the earth at a funeral. Why? Why does a society that has mastered a technology for 3,000 years choose to walk away from its practical use? This is the real mystery of the missing copper, not where it went, where the meaning went. Archaeologists have proposed several answers. None of them is complete. All of them are interesting. One reading is environmental. The most accessible surface deposits had been worked out. Deeper mining required more effort for less return. At a certain point, the economic logic flips. A copper knife is no longer worth the season of work to make a new one. But this answer has a problem. The mines were not exhausted. Surveys today still find copper near the surface on Isle Royale. The miners stopped well before geology forced them to. So the answer must lie somewhere else. A second reading is social. Around 1500 BCE, the cultures of the eastern woodlands began to change. Population grew, trade networks expanded, new ceremonial practices spread. The dead began to be buried with elaborate goods. In that new world, a copper knife was useful, but a copper bead, hammered thin and threaded onto a cord, that was status. The value of the metal shifted with the value system around it. The hand of a wealthy elder mattered more than the cutting edge. A third reading goes deeper. It suggests the people of the old copper complex made a choice we still do not fully understand. They had the metal. They never smelted it. They never alloyed it. They never made bronze. In the Old World, the discovery of bronze, copper hardened with tin or arsenic, kicked off 3,000 years of armed empires. The peoples of the Great Lakes had pure copper in quantities the Old World would have killed for. They did not go down that road. Was it that the necessary alloying metals, tin, arsenic, were not locally available? Tin in particular is rare in eastern North America. That matters. But there is also the possibility that this was, in some sense, a road not taken. A different relationship with metal, a different idea of what metal is for. We may never know which reading is right. The old copper people left no texts. Their descendants' oral histories speak of meanings we cannot fully recover. What we can do is trace where the copper went, because it did go somewhere, just not across an ocean. By around 2000 BCE, copper from Lake Superior was moving south, down the Mississippi, east along the Ohio, across the Great Lakes. We find it as far as Louisiana, as far as the Atlantic coast, as far as the lower Mississippi Valley. At Poverty Point, POV or T Point, the giant earthwork complex in northeastern Louisiana, copper, sourced to Lake Superior. 1,500 miles from the mines, moved by people on foot and in dugout canoes. No wheels, no pack animals, no horses. That is the trade network the real story is built on. Not a transatlantic export to Mycenae. A continental web of rivers and trails. And the logistics of it are staggering when you stop and think about them. So stop and think about them. A copper nugget mined on Isle Royale in May. By June, it has been ferried across 40 miles of open lake water in a birch bark canoe. By August, it has been worked into a finished object at a camp on the southern shore. By the following year, it has changed hands 4 times. A decade later, it sits in a burial mound 1,000 miles south. With it in the grave, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, chert from Arkansas. This is not a primitive economy. This is a continent-scale exchange system running for 2,000 years on muscle and current and seasonal timing. No nation enforced it. No coinage backed it. It ran on something older than money, reciprocity, reputation, ceremony, and it worked. The proof is in every burial mound, from Wisconsin to the Florida Panhandle, that contains a flake of Lake Superior copper. Now, about that transatlantic theory, because the question will come up. Did any of this copper cross the ocean? The claim has been made for nearly a century, most prominently by a handful of independent researchers in the mid-20th century. Their argument hinges on isotopic signatures, chemical fingerprints in bronze artifacts from the Aegean that they claim match Lake Superior copper. Mainstream archaeology has examined this argument and rejected it. The isotopic matches do not hold up under rigorous analysis. The bronze of the Aegean has been traced, convincingly, to sources in Cyprus, in the Levant, in the Balkans. Local sources, Old World sources. There is no archaeological evidence of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact at the scale required to move tons of metal. No wrecks, no anchors, no settlements. The transatlantic copper theory belongs to the fringe of the discipline. It survives because it is romantic, because it makes a continent feel central. But you do not need it. The real story does not need it. The real story is already extraordinary. A hunter-gatherer culture that worked metal before most of the Old World did. That sustained an industry for 4,000 years. That moved copper across half a continent without writing or wheels. That then collectively, over centuries, decided metal meant something else. You do not need to send their copper to Greece to make that interesting. It is interesting on its own terms. So if not Greece, what does happen to the copper? Where physically does it end up? Most of it ends up in graves, hammered thin, rolled into beads, bent into ornaments, laid on the chest of the honored dead. Some of it is recycled. Old objects melted down by later cultures, reworked into new shapes. Copper is endlessly recyclable. It carries no trace of its previous lives. Some of it corrodes back into the earth. Native copper exposed to soil over 4,000 years can oxidize, fragment, and effectively disappear. And some of it, the smallest, most personal pieces, is simply lost, dropped, forgotten, washed down river, buried under silt. The arithmetic of the original myth assumed the copper had to be somewhere intact, but metal in the ground for 4 millennia does not stay intact. The missing copper is not missing. It has been redistributed, recycled, ritualized, and weathered into invisibility. The question was never where it went. The question was always why they made it, and then why they stopped. And that brings us back to the people themselves. Because we have spent a lot of time on copper and very little on the hands that worked it. The old copper people lived in small mobile bands. They hunted, they fished, they gathered wild rice in the marshes of what is now Wisconsin. Their houses were impermanent. Bent saplings covered in bark and hide, set up for a season, abandoned, rebuilt elsewhere. They moved with the seasons, to the lake for fish in summer, to the forest for deer in fall, to sheltered valleys in winter. And every spring, some of them traveled north, across rivers, through forests, to the cold edge of Lake Superior, to the mines. We do not know if mining was specialized work or seasonal labor everyone did. We do not know if women mined or only men. We do not know if children worked. We know they came back, year after year, generation after generation, century after century, until they didn't. If you have made it this far, you may want to stay for the next chapter of this channel. The Continental story keeps unfolding south of the lakes, because the descendants of the old copper people did not vanish when the mines fell quiet. They transformed. The same river networks that moved copper south carried other things, ideas, ceremonies, ways of building. By around 1000 BCE, those river networks fed something new: earthworks, burial mounds, the first monumental architecture in eastern North America. By 500 BCE, the cultures of the Ohio Valley were building geometric enclosures whose precision still puzzles surveyors today. And in many of those mounds, under layers of clay and earth and centuries, sits a small piece of green-stained metal, Lake Superior copper. The mines were quiet. The copper was not. It still moved. It still mattered. It just mattered differently. Which brings us to the deeper point, the one this whole story has been building toward. We tend to read history forward, from simpler to more complex, from stone to bronze to iron, from village to city to empire. We assume that any society that touches metal will follow that path. That metal demands to be smelted. That smelting demands to be alloyed. The old copper complex is evidence that the path is not inevitable, that a society can hold a technology fully for thousands of years and not be carried by it. They knew copper, they worked copper, they traded copper, and they declined to make it the engine of a different kind of civilization. We do not have to read that as failure. We can read it as choice, or as a reflection of what their world actually rewarded. In their world, a copper knife was a tool. A copper bead was a relationship, a debt repaid, a marriage honored, a death witnessed. The metal carried the meanings their society needed it to carry. When the meanings shifted, the metal shifted with them. That is not a primitive economy. That is a society using a material with full awareness of what it could do and full awareness of what it was for. So when you hear the old story about 500 million pounds of vanished copper and a lost American industrial empire, let it go. The empire was never there. The number was wrong. The transatlantic ships did not sail. What was there is harder to summarize and more interesting to learn. A 4,000-year industry, a continental trade web, a deliberate refusal of bronze, a culture whose descendants still live in the Great Lakes region today. The Ojibwe, the Menominee, Menominee, the Potawatomi, Potawatomi, others, their oral histories speak of the copper, of Misquabic, the red metal, of its place in ceremony and in covenant. The metal was never lost. The story of the metal was lost. And that is what we have been recovering, generation by generation, dig by dig. If you have stayed with us this far, you are looking at the map of North America differently than you did 20 minutes ago. You are not looking at an empty continent that waited for someone else to make it interesting. You're looking at a continent that was already running its own deep history, a history with industry, with trade, with craft, with choices about what to do with power once you had it. The headline number was a myth. The headline theory was a fantasy. But the headline question, what happened on the shores of Lake Superior, has an answer. People came. People worked. People mastered a metal older civilizations would conquer empires for. And then, on their own terms, they changed what the metal was for. That is not a heist. That is not an empire. That is something both stranger and more true. It is the longest-running metalworking tradition in the ancient Americas, and one of the longest anywhere in the world. It happened in plain sight, in a place anyone in North America can drive to, on an island most Americans cannot name. The next time you hear that pre-Columbian America was a wilderness, remember this: 4,000 years of mining, 1,500 miles of trade, tens of thousands of finished objects, no headdresses, no teepees, no horses, none of the imagery that Hollywood handed you, just people and copper and a lake. The pictures you have in your head of the first Americans are mostly 19th century, painted later, marketed later, sold to you later. What was actually here was older and quieter, and in many ways more sophisticated than the postcard version. The old copper complex is just one chapter. Other chapters wait, under earthworks in Louisiana, under deserts in Arizona, under the cedar forests of the Pacific Northwest. Each one rewrites a piece of what you thought you knew. Each one was already here before any caravel touched the coast. And none of it needed Mycenae, none of it needed Atlantis. None of it needed to be borrowed from somewhere else to be impressive. It was its own thing. It was always its own thing. And we are only now, slowly, learning how to listen to what it was. So the next time someone tells you about the 500 million pounds of missing copper, you can say that you know. You know the number is wrong. You know the theory is fringe. You know the real story is better. You know that on a long, cold island in a great cold lake, people once spent 4,000 summers prying green metal out of gray rock. You know that they carried it 1,000 miles south on their own backs and in their own canoes. You know they put it in the ground with their dead because, for them, that is where it belonged. You know their descendants are still here, still living near the lake, still carrying pieces of the story, And you know that none of this required a lost empire. The real one was complicated and quiet and exactly the right size for the people who built it. In the next video, we go south to the river country, to a place where, around the same time the copper mines fell quiet, something else was rising. An earthwork the size of a small city, built by people who had no city. 3,000 years before Cahokia. It is called Poverty Point. And the question of how it got there is even stranger than the question of where the copper went. We will be there. If you want to come with us, you know what to do. Until then, keep an eye on the map. There is more under it than anyone told you.